Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? This time, you've really outdone yourselves with the source material, the Oxford Handbook of Political Psychology. Okay, I'm up for the challenge, but this one's a beast.
I know, right? It's dense, but it's packed with insights.
Today, we're going to try to unpack some of those insights, explore the hidden psychological forces that shape, well, pretty much everything in politics.
Yeah, it's kind of like having this X-ray vision into how people make political decisions, what's going on in the minds of leaders on the world stage, even how whole societies are shaped by these underlying currents.
Exactly. So where do we even begin with something this massive?
Well, I think the most logical starting point is the individual voter, right?
Right, the basic building block of any political system.
We all go through this process, sizing up the candidates, picking the one we think will be the best, and then casting our vote. Seems straightforward enough.
But this book digs into how our brains actually work when we're making those choices. And, well, let's just say it's a lot more complicated than it seems.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's this classic theory called rational choice. The idea that voters are these perfect calculators, rationally weighing all the information before making a decision.
Like little supercomputers.
Exactly. But let's be honest, have you ever met a voter who actually acts like that?
Not a single one. So what does this book say about how we really make these decisions if we're not these, perfectly rational beings?
Well, it dives into this idea called behavioral decision theory, and it basically says, look, humans aren't perfect calculators. We use shortcuts, these mental tricks, to make decisions faster, especially when we're faced with a lot of information.
So instead of carefully analyzing every policy position, we're relying on these mental shortcuts. What kind of shortcuts are we talking about?
One example is this thing called the frequency of good and bad features heuristic.
Okay, try saying that 3 times fast.
It's a mouthful, right?
Yeah.
But it's actually a pretty simple concept. Imagine a voter who's pressed for time. They might simply tally up the good and bad things they know about each candidate.
Like a super simplified pros and cons list.
Exactly. But here's the catch. They're not considering how likely those things are to actually happen, or even how important those things really are to them as a voter.
So they might focus on something that sounds really bad, but has a tiny chance of actually happening.
Exactly. It's all about simplifying a complex decision-making process.
Which makes you wonder how many votes are cast based on these mental shortcuts.
And that's where things get really interesting because campaigns and the media, they know about these shortcuts.
Oh yeah, they definitely do.
And they use them strategically to influence how people vote.
So they're playing on our psychology, our tendency to simplify things.
Exactly. They're framing information in a way that taps into those shortcuts, trying to make their candidate seem like the obvious choice, even if it's not based on a, deep understanding of the issues.
That's kind of unsettling when you think about it.
It is. I mean, think about the difference between a campaign rally and a political debate.
Oh, good point.
One is all about presenting a single candidate in the most positive light, playing to the emotions of the crowd. The other forces a side-by-side comparison, maybe a more, shall we say, rational analysis of the candidate's positions.
So which format do you think leads to a more thought-out decision?
Well, I'll leave that for our listeners to ponder.
Good point.
Yeah.
But it does make you realize how much our decision-making can be manipulated without us even realizing it.
It's about being aware of those influences and trying to, be as informed as possible.
Okay, so we've explored the mind of the voter. What about those at the very top? The elites, the leaders, the folks who are actually making the decisions that affect all of us. What does political psychology have to say about them?
That's where things get even more fascinating. Because political psychology doesn't stop at studying voters. It also looks at how leaders see the world and how their perceptions can shape international relations, for example.
Okay, so we're not just talking about domestic politics here. We're talking about global affairs, the decisions that can lead to war or peace.
Exactly. And one of the key insights from this research is the role of misperceptions in foreign policy decision-making.
Misperceptions, you mean like leaders getting things wrong, misunderstanding a situation?
Exactly. I mean, imagine a leader misjudging the intentions of another country.
Which probably happens more often than we'd like to think.
Right. And that kind of miscalculation, it can lead to a tense standoff, an escalation of military activity, or even in the worst case scenario, war.
That's pretty sobering. Any specific historical examples come to mind?
Well, think about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, that was a situation where misperceptions on both sides almost led to a nuclear war.
Whoa, okay, so These misperceptions, they're not just abstract theories, they have real-world consequences.
Exactly, and that's why this field of study is so important because it helps us understand how leaders form their beliefs about the world and where those beliefs might go wrong.
So it's not just about analyzing their personalities, but also understanding how they process information, how they make sense of complex situations.
Exactly, and that's key to preventing conflicts, to keeping things stable on the world stage.
It really makes you think about how fragile things can be, right? I mean, one miscalculation, one misunderstanding, and the whole world could be at risk.
It's a reminder of the importance of clear communication, diplomacy, and a really deep understanding of the other side's perspective.
And that's just scratching the surface of how political psychology helps us understand the complex world of international relations. But for now, let's shift gears a bit and explore another fascinating aspect of this field, the relationship between those in power, the elites, and the masses. And of course, we can't talk about that without talking about the media.
The media, oh yeah, that's a whole other can of worms, but a fascinating one for sure.
I think it's safe to say we all know the media has an agenda, right?
Right.
But this book digs into the psychology behind how they actually shape our opinions. And it's kind of creepy, actually.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It goes beyond just bias. It's about how information is presented, what psychologists call framing. Yeah, like, think about it this way. You have two news sources covering the same protest. One focuses on the disruption, the chaos, the negative aspects. The other focuses on the message the protesters are trying to convey.
Okay, so same event, two totally different ways of presenting it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's framing. It's the same event, but the way it's presented, the words that are used, the images that are shown, all of that shapes how people perceive it.
So it's not just about what we're told, but how we're told it.
Exactly. And this book really dives into how susceptible we are to those subtle cues, to those frames. It's like they're pushing buttons in our brains without us even knowing it.
That is both fascinating and disturbing.
It is.
It makes you want to go back and analyze every news story you've ever read.
Right. Like, wait a minute, was I manipulated into thinking this?
Exactly. But let's move on to something a bit heavier.
Okay.
This book also delves into a pretty sensitive but crucial topic: prejudice and conflict.
Yeah, that's a big one.
How does political psychology approach this, this age-old problem?
Well, it goes beyond simply labeling people as prejudiced or not. It tries to understand the underlying psychological processes that can make entire groups hostile towards each other.
So it's not just about individual bad actors, but something more deeply rooted in how we, as humans, perceive the world, how our brains work.
Exactly. One of the key concepts here is something called in-group favoritism.
In-group favoritism.
Yeah, it's this idea that we naturally favor people we see as part of our group, even if that group is based on something as trivial as, supporting the same sports team.
Oh, come on, that's totally harmless.
Well, it might seem harmless, but it can actually contribute to prejudice because it creates this us versus them mentality. Even if we don't realize it, we start to see people outside our group as different, as maybe even threatening.
Wow, I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, it's like our brains are kind of wired for this kind of tribalism.
That's a pretty sobering thought. But I'm hoping this book isn't all doom and gloom. It also talks about collective action, about how people come together to create positive change.
Yeah.
Right, social movements and all of that.
Right, and that's where the power of shared identity and purpose comes in.
So what motivates people to join a movement, to risk their time, sometimes even their safety for a cause?
Well, one key factor is this idea of instrumentality, the belief that a movement can actually achieve its goals. It's not enough to just be passionate about a cause. You have to believe that taking action can actually make a difference.
So it's about hope, about believing in the power of collective action.
Exactly.
Any historical examples come to mind?
Oh, tons. I mean, think about the civil rights movement. People put their lives on the line because they believed in a better future, and they believed that by acting together, they could bring about that change.
Powerful stuff. It shows how psychological forces can be used for good, not just for, manipulating voters or escalating conflicts. Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. All of these seemingly separate topics, voting decisions, elite perceptions, media influence, prejudice, even social movements, they're all connected by these fundamental principles of psychology.
It's all about understanding human behavior, the forces that drive us, the ways we perceive the world, and how all of that plays out in the political arena.
It's like we're peeling back the layers of human behavior, revealing the hidden gears that make the whole political machine tick.
Exactly. And that's what makes political psychology so fascinating. It gives us this new lens for viewing the world, for understanding why things happen the way they do.
I'm already feeling like I have a whole new toolkit for decoding the political world. Okay, before we move on, I have to ask, what about personality? Does that factor into all of this?
Oh, that's a great question. And the answer is absolutely. Because political psychology isn't just about external factors, it also looks at individual differences in personality and how those traits can influence our political views.
So you're saying that some people are just wired to be more conservative or liberal.
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. It's not about fitting people into neat categories. But certain personality traits, like authoritarianism, for example, have been shown to correlate with certain political leanings.
Authoritarianism. What does that even mean in a political context?
It's a personality trait that's characterized by a preference for order, tradition, and deference to authority. People high in authoritarianism, they might be more drawn to strong leaders, traditional social norms, things like that.
So it's not a perfect predictor, but it shows how our personalities can influence our political views.
Right. It's like our personalities are interacting with the political world around us.
This brings up another question, the classic nature versus nurture debate. Are we born with these political predispositions, or are they shaped by our experiences?
That's the age-old question, isn't it? And political psychology acknowledges that it's not an either-or situation, it's both. Our genes, they might give us a certain temperament, but our upbringing, our experiences, all of that shapes who we become politically.
So it's like a recipe. You have the basic ingredients, but how you combine them, how you cook them, that's what determines the final product.
That's a great analogy, and this book does a great job of teasing apart those different influences.
Speaking of influences, I remember reading something in here about political generations. Is there any truth to this idea that people born in a certain era share similar political views?
Yeah, there's definitely evidence to support that because, major historical events, social movements, even cultural trends, they leave their mark on a generation. They shape how we see the world, what we value.
Like think about the Vietnam War or Watergate.
Exactly. Those events shape the political landscape for decades to come.
It's like each generation inherits this kind of political DNA from the era they were born into.
And those generational differences, they can have a huge impact on how we vote, what issues we prioritize, how we engage in the political process.
I'm already thinking about the younger generation today, growing up in the age of social media and climate change. What kind of political DNA are they inheriting?
That's a great question. And it highlights the importance of understanding this thing called political socialization, the process of how we form our political beliefs and values.
It makes you realize that politics isn't just about the here and now. It's about the long game, how today's events are going to shape the world for generations to come.
It's all connected.
And that leads us to another really important area that this book explores, the idea that political forces actually shape the very fabric of society. I mean, we've talked about individual beliefs and behaviors, but how does all of this play out on a larger scale?
Right. I mean, how do political decisions, how does political rhetoric shape our culture, our institutions, our everyday lives?
Give us an example of how this interplay between politics and society actually manifests itself.
Well, think about the impact of political rhetoric on public discourse. The way politicians frame issues, the language they use, the narratives they push, all of that can influence how society views those issues.
So it's not just about winning elections. It's about shaping the narrative, controlling the conversation.
Exactly. And it can have a real impact on how people behave, how they treat each other, even what they consider acceptable or unacceptable.
So political messaging can seep into our everyday lives,
Hmm.
impacting our values, our beliefs, even our relationships with each other.
Right?
This is making me think about the responsibility that comes with the political power, the power to shape not just policies, but the very culture we live in.
It's a reminder that politics is about more than just elections and laws. It's about ideas, values, and behaviors and how they shape our collective experience.
Wow. Okay, we've talked about beliefs and attitudes, but what about values? Are they different, and do they play a distinct role in political psychology?
Yeah, values are definitely distinct from attitudes. I mean, attitudes are evaluations of specific things, right? Like, do I like this candidate or not? But values, they're our core beliefs about what's good, desirable, important. They're the guiding principles that shape our choices, both personally and politically.
So in a way, values are like our internal compass, guiding our moral and political decisions.
That's a great way to put it. And political psychology explores how those values influence our political orientation, our behavior.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Think about the classic example of individualism versus collectivism. People who prioritize individual freedom, self-reliance, they tend to lean towards certain political ideologies, maybe more libertarian or conservative.
Right.
While those who emphasize social harmony, group welfare, they might favor more collectivist approaches like social democracy or socialism.
So these deeply held values can actually manifest in our political preferences, even shape our views on the role of government in society.
Exactly. It's all connected. And understanding these underlying values can give us real insights into, what motivates people politically.
This has been incredibly eye-opening. We've gone from individual voters all the way up to global leaders, explored media manipulation, uncovered the roots of prejudice, and even touched on the psychology of social movements. And it's all about understanding the human element in politics.
And we've only just scratched the surface of what this book has to offer. There's so much more to explore.
I feel like I've gained a whole new toolkit for decoding the political world, which I think we'll need for the rest of this deep dive. But before we wrap up this first part, I have one more question. We were talking about how political psychology explores the interplay between, the elites and the masses.
Right, that dynamic.
But I'm curious, is there a psychological perspective on how those elites actually gain and maintain power? Like, what makes a successful leader tick, psychologically speaking?
Oh, absolutely. There's a whole area of research on the psychology of leadership, and it's particularly fascinating when you apply it to the political realm.
So it's not just about charisma or being a smooth talker.
I mean, those things can help, for sure, but there's a lot more going on beneath the surface. Political psychology looks at personality traits, leadership styles, even the cognitive processes that come into play when leaders make decisions.
So it's about how they think, how they process information, how they handle pressure.
Exactly. And how they perceive threats, how they manage risks, how they navigate the really complex social dynamics of power. It's a fascinating puzzle.
Are there certain traits or strategies that make some leaders more effective than others?
Well, there's no magic formula for success, of course, but research does suggest that effective political leaders often possess a certain blend of traits and skills.
Like what? Give us the inside scoop.
Well, strong communication skills are a must, obviously. The ability to inspire trust and confidence is crucial. And a deep understanding of human motivation, that's really essential for any leader who wants to be successful.
Makes you wonder if those qualities are something you're born with or if they can be developed over time.
It's probably a mix of both. Some people might have a natural inclination toward leadership, but many of those skills can be honed through experience, mentorship, and, a deliberate effort to learn and grow. It's like any other skill, really. Practice and learning play a huge role.
This deep dive has been absolutely incredible. I mean, we've gone from individual voters to global leaders, explored media manipulation, the roots of prejudice, the dynamics of social movements, even the psychology of leadership.
It's amazing how much we can learn about politics when we examine the human element.
It's like you said at the beginning, it's like having this backstage pass to the inner workings of the political world, revealing the hidden motivations and forces that drive so much of what we see.
It really encourages us to think critically about our own political beliefs and behaviors, to recognize the power of psychology in shaping outcomes.
And ultimately to become more informed and engaged citizens, right?
Exactly. That's the goal, isn't it?
Absolutely. So if we can understand the psychological forces that drive political behavior, can we use that knowledge to build a more just and peaceful world? It's a question worth pondering.
Definitely something to think about.
Until our next deep dive, keep exploring and stay curious. So much to unpack here. We just touched on how deeply our values can shape our political leanings, but this book also delves into how those values play out on a societal level.
It's like zooming out from the individual to see how these values shape the very fabric of a society, its institutions, its culture, everything.
And how does that work exactly?
Well, think about it. Different societies prioritize different values, right? Some emphasize individual freedom and self-reliance.
Like the classic American ideal of the rugged individualist.
Exactly. Others might prioritize social harmony, community well-being, a more collectivist approach. And these different value systems, they have a huge impact on how those societies function.
So the values a society embraces can shape its political system, its economic policies, its approach to social welfare, everything.
It's all interconnected, and that's one of the key takeaways from this book, the idea that political psychology isn't just about individual minds, it's about understanding the collective mind of a society, its values, its beliefs, and how those shape its destiny.
It's like we're looking at the soul of a nation. trying to understand what makes it tick.
Exactly. And that's what makes this field so fascinating. It's not just about analyzing data or studying theories. It's about understanding what it means to be human in all of our complexity and how that humanity shapes the political world we live in.
I have to say, this deep dive has been a real eye-opener. We've explored so many different facets of political psychology, from the inner workings of the voter's mind to the complexities of international relations, the subtle power of the media, the dark side of prejudice, and the inspiring potential of collective action.
It's a lot to take in, for sure.
It really is. But it's also incredibly empowering because it gives us this new framework for understanding the political world, for seeing beyond the surface, for recognizing the deeper forces at play.
And hopefully for becoming more informed, more engaged, and ultimately more effective citizens.
That's the ultimate goal, isn't it? To use this knowledge to make the world a better place.
Absolutely. Because if we can understand the forces that shape our political realities, well, maybe we can start to change them for the better.
Food for thought. Until our next deep dive, keep exploring, stay curious, and never stop questioning the world around you.